Catherine the Great, an empress whose name is synonymous with the power and luxury of the Russian Empire. Her treasures have become legendary, but one mystery still stirs the imagination: the legend of the lost ring, a talisman that gave her power and disappeared without a trace. Did it really exist? Or is it just a beautiful fairy tale hiding something more? We will immerse ourselves in the world of palace intrigues, study secret archives, and follow the trail of lost relics to separate truth from fiction and discover what really lies behind the legend of the most mysterious treasure of the House of Romanov. The 18th century, a time of great upheaval and unprecedented prosperity for the Russian Empire, went down in history under the reign of one of its most colorful and controversial figures, Empress Catherine II, known as Catherine the Great. Her era was a period of colossal territorial acquisitions, profound reforms, and, of course, the flourishing of the arts and sciences. But behind all this grandeur, the glamour of court life and the dazzling balls lay not only affairs of state, but also personal passions and, of course, untold riches. Catherine was known for her passion for jewelry. This was not just a whim of the monarch, but part of state policy, a demonstration of the empire's power and prosperity on the world stage. Jewelry was a symbol of status, influence, and wealth. The empress understood this better than anyone else, and actively used jewelry to assert her authority and prestige. Her collections were rightly considered among the richest in Europe. Necklaces, earrings, brooches, tiaras, and, of course, rings were all an integral part of her image and everyday life. The palace annals contain descriptions of many unique pieces of jewelry made by the best craftsmen of their time. Each item was a work of art, the embodiment of refinement and craftsmanship. Many of them were presented to her by diplomats and nobles, or created to her personal order. But among all this splendor, a mysterious story has survived through the centuries, stirring the minds of historians and researchers to this day. The story of Catherine the Great's lost ring. Does this ring really exist? Was it ever part of her collection? Or is it just a beautiful legend, born of time and popular rumor? This question has been the source of much speculation, artistic works, and even detective investigations. Delving into this story, we encounter a lack of direct historical evidence of a specific lost ring that the empress would have worn constantly, and which would have subsequently disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Unlike the well-known imperial regalia, such as the scepter or the orb, which are clearly documented, there is no accurate information about a certain lost ring. This leads us to wonder, what exactly is meant by this phrase? Perhaps it refers to one of her many personal jewelry items that was lost or sold after the revolution in 1917, when many of the Romanov treasures left Russia. Or perhaps it is a more abstract concept associated with the general losses of the imperial collection, a symbol of something irretrievably lost. Our task is to investigate these versions, analyze the available facts, and separate historical truth from fiction in order to shed light on this century-old mystery. It is no coincidence that the reign of Catherine II is referred to as the Golden Age of the Russian Empire. It was a time when the power of the state was manifested not only on the battlefield and in diplomatic receptions, but also in the dazzling brilliance of the precious stones that adorned the imperial court. Catherine's passion for jewelry was truly boundless and went far beyond a simple feminine hobby. It was a manifestation of imperial ambition, an instrument of state policy, and a driving force behind the development of Russian jewelry. The empress did not simply collect jewelry. She created a system, a true treasure of the nation. which is known today as the Diamond Fund. It was under her that the so-called Diamond Room was established in the Winter Palace, a special repository that housed not only the crown jewels, but also the personal jewels of the monarchs. It was not just a repository, but a symbol of the stability and wealth of the empire, its gold reserve embodied in diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires. Only the most trusted individuals had access to this room, and its contents amazed even the most sophisticated European aristocrats. Catherine had refined taste and was a true connoisseur of gemstones. She did not follow fashion, but set it herself. Her love for diamonds was particularly strong. She saw these stones as a symbol of eternity, indestructibility, and the purity of power. Under her reign, the finest diamonds from all over the world were brought to Russia, where court jewelers turned them into masterpieces. But her interests were not limited to diamonds. The Empress highly valued colored stones, especially those mined in the vast expanses of her empire. Ural emeralds, Siberian aquamarines, and tourmalines became central elements in necklaces and tiaras, emphasizing not only the wealth of the court, but also the natural riches of Russia itself. However, she had one very special passion, which she jokingly called her cameo disease. This was glyptics, the art of carving precious and semi-precious stones. Catherine assembled one of the world's greatest collections of cameos and intaglios, numbering more than 10,000 pieces. Her agents throughout Europe bought up entire collections, and she studied each new piece with delight under a magnifying glass, seeing in these miniature works of art a living link with the antiquity she so revered. This collection was a source of particular pride for her, and she even commissioned the famous Green Frog service with images of English landscapes, and for herself, the Cameo service, where each piece was decorated with one of her cameos. This passion for collecting treasures also had a purely practical, political dimension. The splendor of the Russian court was intended to dazzle foreign ambassadors and monarchs, demonstrating to them the power and prosperity of the Northern Empire. Jewelry was an important diplomatic tool. Snuff boxes and rings, generously encrusted with diamonds, were given as gifts to European dignitaries whose loyalty needed to be won. She literally showered her favorites, such as Grigory Orlov and Grigory Potemkin, with jewels, which was not only a sign of personal affection, but also a public declaration of their high status and, therefore, of her own power. Every ball in the Winter Palace turned into a competition of luxury, where ladies and gentlemen dazzled with their jewelry, setting the tone for the entire European aristocracy. The best craftsmen of their time worked in this luxury industry. Jewelers such as the Swiss Jeremy Pozzi and the French Jean-Pierre Ador and Leopold Pfister created true masterpieces for the Empress. It was Pozzi who created the Grand Imperial Crown for her. The jewelry workshops of St. Petersburg worked tirelessly, fulfilling countless orders from the court. Thus, during the era of Catherine, jewelry making in Russia reached its peak, and in this ocean of documented, described, and catalogued treasures, where every brooch and every snuff box had its own history, the mysterious lost ring seems even more of a mystery. If it existed, how could it have disappeared without a trace amid such meticulous record-keeping and adoration? Among the countless pieces of jewelry that belonged to Catherine the Great, the imperial regalia held a special, sacred place. These were not just decorations, no matter how expensive they were, but sacred symbols of monarchical power, the embodiment of the state, its sovereignty, and its divine right to rule. Unlike personal jewels, which could be given away, exchanged, or even sold, the state regalia, the scepter, orb, and crown, were inviolable. Their history was carefully documented, and their preservation was ensured at the state level. It was these items, and not some hypothetical ring, that were the true main treasures not only of the Empress, but of the entire Russian Empire. Their creation and use were strictly regulated and accompanied by complex ceremonies that emphasized their exceptional status. For the coronation of Catherine II, which took place in Moscow in 1762, new regalia were created in a very short time, which were intended to outshine everything seen before and confirm the legitimacy of her accession to the throne. The central element of this ensemble was the Grand Imperial Crown, an unrivaled masterpiece of jewelry art. Its creation was entrusted to court jeweler Georg Friedrich Eckart and diamond master Jérémy Posier. In just 2.5 months, they created a miracle. The crown's silver frame was shaped like two hemispheres, symbolizing the unity of the West and the East under the Russian monarchy. These hemispheres were studded with nearly 5,000 select diamonds, creating a dazzling glow. They were framed at the bottom by 2 rows of 75 large matte pearls, emphasizing the cold brilliance of the diamonds. But the main decoration of the crown, its crown jewel, was a giant gemstone, a noble spinel of a rich red color, weighing almost 400 carats. This historic stone, purchased in Beijing in the 17th century, was crowned with a diamond cross symbolizing the Orthodox faith as the foundation of autocracy. The crown was not just a headdress, but a cosmological model of the empire, its visible embodiment in precious metals and stones. No less impressive was the imperial scepter, which was also created for Catherine's coronation. Its smooth golden surface was divided into 3 parts by diamond rims, but its main treasure was the legendary Orlov diamond. The history of this stone is shrouded in mystery. According to one of the most widespread legends, it was once the eye of a statue of Brahma in an Indian temple, from where it was stolen by a French soldier. After many wanderings around the world, the stone ended up in Amsterdam, where it was purchased for the Empress by her favorite, Count Grigory Orlov. In 1773, on her name day, Catherine received this incredible gift, a diamond of the purest water, weighing almost 190 carats. She soon ordered it to be set in the pommel of her scepter, where it remains to this day. This gesture was full of symbolism. The most famous diamond of its time became part of the Russian state symbol, forever linking the name of Orlov with the history of the empire. The third most important regalia was the orb, a golden ball crowned with a cross, symbolizing the monarch's power over the world. Catherine's scepter was adorned with a huge Ceylon sapphire weighing 200 carats and encircled by diamond garlands. These 3 items, the crown, the scepter, and the orb, formed the indestructible core of the state treasures. Their history is well known and can be traced down to the smallest detail. Against this backdrop of crystal clarity and strict documentary accountability, the absence of any mention of a lost ring of state importance seems more than convincing evidence. If such a ring had existed and had even 1/100th of the significance of these regalia, its disappearance would have been an event of national importance that would inevitably have left a trace in the archives. The grandeur of Catherine the Great's imperial court was forged not only in the smoke of battle and on the diplomatic stage, but also in the silence of jewelry workshops, where the most talented craftsmen of their time transformed cold stones and lifeless metal into symbols of power and eternal beauty. The Empress was not just a customer, she was a patron and a connoisseur who managed to attract the best jewelers in Europe to Russia and create conditions for their talent to flourish. These craftsmen were not just artisans, they were confidants, artists, and chroniclers of the era, whose creations bore the imprint of her personality and ambitions. Their names are forever inscribed in the history of Russian art, and their works constitute the golden fund of the world's major museums. It is thanks to them that the splendor of the Catherine era became not a metaphor, but a tangible reality. Every stone that passed through their hands was given not only a setting, but also a history, and their activities were strictly documented, making the idea of the existence of a secret, unrecorded masterpiece highly unlikely. Among the galaxy of outstanding masters, the figure of the Swiss Jérôme Posier stands out. He arrived in Russia as a young man and devoted several decades to serving the Russian court. Possessing not only talent but also business acumen, he became the chief court jeweler and appraiser. He is the author of the priceless Memoirs, in which he described in detail the customs of the court, his relationship with the Empress, and, of course, his work on his greatest creation, the Grand Imperial Crown. Posier was not just an executor. He was a co-author of the imperial myth. He recalled how Catherine personally selected the stones and how she delved into every detail of the project, wanting the crown to be a visible embodiment of her enlightened absolutism. Another genius, Georg Friedrich Eckart, who created the sketch for the crown, worked alongside him. Their joint work became the pinnacle of 18th-century jewelry art. Another key master was the Frenchman Jean-Pierre Ador, famous for his enamels and the creation of luxurious snuff boxes, which the Empress generously presented to her courtiers and foreign diplomats. Each snuff box was a work of art, decorated with miniature portraits or allegorical scenes. We must not forget the Duval brothers, Johann Gottlieb and Jakob David, whose hands created countless brooches, buckles, earrings, and rings. Their style was distinguished by its refinement and lightness, in keeping with the spirit of the Rococo. It is important to understand that the work of these craftsmen was inseparable from the creation of the Diamond Fund. They not only created new jewelry, but also systematized, evaluated, and cataloged existing treasures. Each item that entered the diamond room was carefully described, weighed, and entered into special registers. Catherine was very scrupulous in financial matters and demanded a full account of the expenditure of public funds and the state of her personal treasury. This meticulous bureaucracy and total accounting of every piece of jewelry is a powerful argument against the existence of a legendary lost ring. If such a piece of jewelry, possessing special value, historical or material, had really existed, it would inevitably have been recorded in one of the numerous inventory lists. Its absence from the documents does not indicate that its disappearance is a mystery, but rather that its very existence is most likely the product of later fiction. These great jewelers did not create myths, but real, tangible treasures, whose history is known to this day. In addition to the state regalia, which served as symbols of imperial power, Catherine the Great's personal treasury was no less impressive and diverse. It was a world in which her personal tastes, affections, and even whims found expression in precious stones and metals. While the regalia were part of official ceremonies, personal jewelry was an integral part of her daily life, her image, and her interactions with her inner circle. It is in this vast but carefully documented collection that one should look for traces of the supposed lost ring. However, the deeper we delve into the inventories and testimonies of contemporaries, the clearer it becomes that the Empress's collection, for all its immensity, was far from chaotic. Each item had its place and its purpose, and none of them fit the description of a unique, sacred, and subsequently lost relic in the form of a ring. The Empress's everyday jewelry wardrobe was extensive. It included dozens and hundreds of items. These were numerous brooches, which she used to fasten lace jabots or fur capes. These were luxurious watches encrusted with diamonds, which she wore on her belt as a fashion accessory. These were bracelets, often in pairs, decorated with her monogram or miniature portraits. Snuff boxes held a special place. In the 18th century, a snuff box was not just a container for snuff, but an important status symbol, a collector's item, and a favorite diplomatic gift. Catherine's collection included hundreds of snuff boxes made of gold, silver, jasper, and agate, decorated with enamel, painting, and precious stones. Each was a unique work of art. She gave them to her favorites, ministers, and foreign monarchs. But none of them had the status of a personal talisman to such an extent that its loss would give rise to a legend. And, of course, rings. Catherine, like any woman of her era, wore many rings. These included signet rings with large solitaire diamonds, rings with a scattering of smaller stones, and signet rings with carved coats of arms. But her main passion, as we have already mentioned, was glyptics. Cameos formed the core of her personal collection and were her pride and joy. She had them set everywhere, in brooches, bracelets, and, of course, rings. She had dozens of rings with cameos depicting ancient gods, heroes, Roman emperors, and philosophers. Each ring was not just a piece of jewelry for her, but a companion, a reminder of the great past with which she felt a spiritual kinship. She studied them, cataloged them, and showed them to her guests. This cameo obsession was well documented. There are detailed descriptions of her gem collection compiled during her lifetime, and in none of these descriptions, in none of the letters or memoirs of her contemporaries, is there the slightest hint of a single special ring that stood out from the rest. There are no mentions of a ring of power, a talisman ring, or a bequest ring. There were hundreds of rings, and each was valuable in its own way. But this value was either material, artistic, or intellectual, but not sacred. The idea that, among this abundance, a single ring could disappear without a trace, leaving no record in documents or in the memory of contemporaries, contradicts everything we know about the great empress's meticulousness and passion for collecting. The history of the Romanov family's treasures does not end with the death of Catherine the Great or the fall of the monarchy. On the contrary, its most dramatic and tragic act unfolded in the 20th century, after the Revolution of 1917. It was in this chaos, in this era of great upheaval, when empires collapsed and destinies were rewritten, that the legend of the lost ring could have originated. If such a piece of jewelry ever existed, its traces were most likely lost, not in the 18th century, but in the 1920s and 1930s, during the so-called currency auctions, when the Soviet government began a massive sell-off of national treasures abroad. It was an operation unprecedented in its scale, aimed at obtaining hard currency for the needs of industrialization. Everything went under the hammer. Paintings from the Hermitage, icons, furniture from the royal palaces, and, of course, jewels from the Diamond Fund. After coming to power, the Bolsheviks nationalized all the imperial treasures. In 1922, a special commission of the Gokran, the State Depository of Values, was created to conduct an audit and appraisal of the former crown diamonds and other jewels. This titanic task was led by the outstanding Russian mineralogist, academician Alexander Evgenyevich Fersman. Together with a group of experts, including the best jewelers and art historians, he carried out a complete inventory of the treasures under the harshest conditions of cold and hunger. The result of their work was the publication in 1925 of the fundamental catalog, The Diamond Fund of the USSR. This publication, released in 4 languages, contained detailed descriptions, photographs, and historical information on 406 items, including all the main regalia. Fersman's catalog was both a scientific feat and, in essence, a luxurious auction catalog intended for Western buyers. The active phase of sales began in the late 1920s. Soviet trade representatives in Europe and America sought buyers for unique treasures. Auctions were organized, the most famous of which took place in London, at Christie's Auction House in March 1927. 121 items were put up for auction: tiaras, necklaces, brooches, and Fabergé Easter eggs. Among the masterpieces sold was, for example, the coronation crown of the last Russian empress, Alexandra Feodorovna. Many of the jewels were barbarically dismantled. Large stones were removed, and the settings melted down. The most valuable historical relics were sometimes sold by weight, like scrap precious metals. The buyers were both well-known collectors, such as American socialite Marjorie Post and Armenian oil magnate Kaluste Gulbenkian, and anonymous dealers. The traces of many treasures were lost forever. They ended up in private collections, were passed down through inheritance, changed owners, and their origins were forgotten over time. It was in this murky world of sales that any item, including the hypothetical ring, could have been lost. It could have been sold without a proper description, as part of a lot with other, less significant items. It could lose its historical biography and become simply an antique diamond ring. Thus, if the mystery does exist, its origins should be sought not in the palace intrigues of Catherine's era, but in the pragmatic and cruel politics of the IVUT, 20th century. The sale of the Diamond Fund's treasures in the 1920s and 1930s was a national tragedy. But the story did not end there. Decades later, when the political situation changed and the scale of the cultural losses was realized, a long and painstaking process of searching for and, in some rare cases, returning the lost relics began. This work, comparable to a detective investigation, is being carried out by historians, art experts, museum workers, and collectors around the world. Every item found whose Romanov origin can be proven becomes a sensation. Studying the history of these searches and discoveries gives us another clue to solving the mystery of the lost ring. If such a significant piece of jewelry really existed and had been sold, it would have become the holy grail for researchers, and the search for it would have been as active as the search for other famous masterpieces. However, there is no evidence in scientific and museum circles of a targeted search for Catherine the Great's specific ring. One of the most striking examples of how treasures found new life abroad is the collection of Marjorie Merriweather Post, heiress to a huge business empire. In the 1930s, she lived in Moscow with her husband, who was the American ambassador, and actively bought artworks that the Soviet government was selling. She acquired many personal items belonging to the Romanovs, including the wedding crown of Empress Alexandra Feodorovna and a huge number of items made by Fabergé. Today, her collection forms the basis of the Hillwood Museum in Washington and is the largest collection of Russian imperial art outside Russia. A study of the museum's catalogs, as well as other large collections, has revealed no trace of the mysterious ring. Nevertheless, some items were returned to their homeland. This process intensified in the 1990s and 2000s, when Russian businessmen and patrons began buying items related to Russian history at Western auctions and donating them to state museums. For example, businessman Victor Vekselberg purchased and returned to Russia a unique collection of Fabergé Easter eggs that once belonged to the imperial family. Each such return is the result of enormous research work. Experts have to compare items with archival photographs and descriptions from Fersman's catalog, conduct gemological examinations, and reconstruct the chain of ownership. This is extremely difficult work that requires proof. In this context, the complete absence of the lost ring from the lists of wanted items is particularly telling. No serious study devoted to the fate of the Romanov treasures mentions the search for this particular artifact. The famous necklace of Empress Maria Feodorovna has been and continues to be sought, as have individual tiaras and brooches whose history is known. But no one is looking for Catherine's ring. This suggests that the item exists more in the realm of myth and popular culture than in real history. It may have been invented by a writer or journalist, or simply born out of vague stories about untold riches and great losses, becoming a collective image of all the lost treasures of the imperial family. Since no special lost ring of Catherine the Great appears in the imperial inventories, the reports of the State Property Committee, or the lists of wanted valuables, we inevitably come to the conclusion that its story belongs not to the world of facts, but to the world of legends. But how and why are such myths born? Their emergence is a complex cultural process based not on deception, but on a collective need for mystery, romanticization of the past, and the search for hidden meanings. The story of the missing ring is a classic example of how a historical vacuum, a lack of accurate information, is filled with speculation that over time takes on the appearance of irrefutable truth. The basis for such a legend was more than fertile. The Empress's colossal, almost mythical wealth on the one hand, and the dramatic, chaotic story of its sale and loss on the other. Firstly, Catherine II herself was a figure who lent herself to the creation of legends. Vivid, powerful, and controversial, she still captures the imagination today. Her long and eventful era, with its palace coups, numerous favorites, and grandiose projects, became the perfect setting for stories of secret conspiracies, hidden treasures, and fateful talismans. In this context, the ring is the perfect symbol. It is not just a piece of jewelry, but a deeply personal and intimate object. It can symbolize a secret marriage, an oath, inherited power, or even magical protection. Unlike a crown or a scepter, which belong to the state, a ring belongs to an individual. It is this intimacy that makes it so attractive to myth-makers. The legend of the lost ring allows us to touch the personal mystery of a great empress. Secondly, the history of the 20th century itself played a huge role. The revolution and the subsequent sale of treasures created an unprecedented break in historical continuity. Thousands of items were torn from their context, deprived of their history, and scattered around the world. This chaos gave rise to the feeling that anything could have been lost. Popular rumor does not operate with archival descriptions. It thinks in images. And the image of the lost ring became a convenient and capacious symbol of all the lost treasures of the Romanovs. It is easier to talk about one specific, albeit fictional, object than about hundreds of faceless items in auction catalogs. The ring became a collective image, the quintessence of this national trauma associated with the loss of cultural heritage. It became a symbol of a bygone era of splendor and power, a small shining fragment of a shattered empire. Thus, the legend of the ring is not so much a historical puzzle as a cultural phenomenon, reflecting our nostalgia for a great past and our eternal longing for unsolved mysteries. One of the reasons why the myth of Catherine's lost ring could arise and take root in the public consciousness is a simple confusion of terms and names. Human memory, especially collective memory, tends to simplify and mix up disparate concepts, especially if they sound similar. In the history of Moscow and Russia, there are several well-known rings that have nothing to do with jewelry, but whose names passed down by word of mouth, could have been transformed into a legend about the Empress's personal jewelry. Having sorted out this toponymic and historical confusion, we can cut off another layer of speculation and come closer to understanding the origins of the legend. The most famous of these rings is undoubtedly the Boulevard Ring in Moscow. The Boulevard Ring is a chain of 10 boulevards in the center of the Russian capital. Historically, it was built on the site of the demolished walls and towers of the White City, the third, after the Kremlin and Kitai-Gorod, fortress wall of Moscow. The decree to demolish the dilapidated fortifications and build boulevards for public promenades in their place was issued by Catherine the Great in 1774. Thus, the Empress is directly responsible for the creation of this grandiose urban ensemble. It is quite possible that in the popular memory, the phrase Catherine's ring, or the ring created under Catherine, has lost its original architectural meaning over time. The grandiose project, which encompassed the center of the ancient capital, could have been metaphorically reinterpreted and reduced to the size of a personal precious piece of jewelry. This is a typical mechanism of mythologization. A complex and large-scale phenomenon is reduced to a simple and understandable image. In addition to the Boulevard Ring, there is also the Garden Ring, which also arose on the site of ancient fortifications, the earthen rampart. Although its final formation dates back to the 19th century, the beginning of this process can also be linked to the Catherine era of urban transformation. In addition, there is a third possible reason for the confusion, which lies in the religious sphere. In the Christian tradition, especially in Catholicism, there is the concept of the mystical betrothal of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. This saint, who lived in the 4th century, is considered the heavenly patroness of brides and learning. The story of her mystical betrothal to the infant Christ, who places a ring on her finger as a sign of spiritual union, was extremely popular in European art. Catherine II, who bore the name of this saint, was well aware of this story. It is possible that at some point there was a contamination, a mixing of the images of Empress Catherine and Saint Catherine. Stories about the sacred ring of Saint Catherine could have been mistakenly transferred to her namesake, the Russian Empress, and turned into a legend about her own special talisman ring in the popular imagination. All these factors, urban planning, toponymy, and religion, created fertile ground for confusion, which probably became one of the sources of the myth about the missing jewel. Legends and speculation are fascinating, but for historians, documents are the main source of truth. It is in the silence of the archives, in dusty folios and letters yellowed by time, that the key to many historical mysteries lies. To finally answer the question of the existence of the lost ring, it is necessary to turn to the primary sources, the vast layer of documentation that remains from the Catherine era and subsequent periods. And here we are met with deafening silence. Systematic searches conducted by generations of historians and museum workers have not revealed a single piece of documentary evidence confirming the existence of a special, legendary ring, let alone its mysterious disappearance. In this case, the absence of evidence is in itself compelling proof. Where exactly should such evidence be sought? First of all, in the archives that hold the documentation of the imperial court. The main repository is the Russian State Archive of Ancient Acts, RGADA, in Moscow. It is there that the funds of His Imperial Majesty's cabinet are located, where all the financial records of the court were kept. Any purchase or order of jewelry, especially significant, would certainly have been recorded in the income and expenditure books. The Empress's personal property inventories, which were compiled periodically, are also kept there. These detailed documents list everything from furniture and dresses to the last snuff box. None of these inventories mention a ring that would stand out from hundreds of others in terms of its description or status. Another important source is the documents of the Diamond Fund itself, kept in the State Archive of the Russian Federation, GARF. These are primarily the inventory lists of the Diamond Room from the 18th and 19th centuries, as well as the aforementioned catalog compiled by academician Fersman in 1925. These documents were created with the utmost care. Each item was described with an indication of its weight, metal fineness, quantity, quality, and weight of stones, and often with a brief historical reference. If there had been a ring of special state or memorial significance among the treasures, it would certainly have been noted. But it is not there. Finally, the third layer of documents is personal correspondence. Catherine the Great was a prolific writer, and her epistolary legacy is enormous. She corresponded with Voltaire, Diderot, Baron Grimm, and many others. In these letters, she often shared news of court life and talked about her hobbies, including her cameo obsession. If a ring with some important history had appeared or disappeared from her life, it is highly likely that she would have mentioned it in a letter to one of her trusted correspondents. But even here, the search yields no results. Thus, the archival data paints a clear picture. The story of Catherine the Great's lost ring is a phantom with no documentary basis. If the archives are silent, where does the myth of the lost ring draw its vitality from? The answer is simple: from the world of art, literature, and cinema. It is artistic fiction that has the unique ability to create vivid, memorable images that, when repeated many times, begin to be perceived as historical reality. The story of a mysterious artifact belonging to a great monarch is a classic plot device, the eternal driving force behind the adventure and detective genres. Writers and screenwriters are not bound by strict historical accuracy. Their task is to captivate the reader and viewer. And Catherine's lost ring is the perfect tool for this, a so-called MacGuffin, as defined by Alfred Hitchcock. It is an object that everyone is chasing, which drives the plot. But in itself, it can be anything. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, many historical and pseudo-historical novels were written about the Catherine era. In them, the Empress was portrayed as a wise ruler, a cunning schemer, or a passionate woman. The authors of such works often introduced fictional details into the narrative to enhance the dramatic effect. These could be a secret will, an encrypted letter, or, very conveniently, some kind of symbolic ornament. A ring is ideal for this role. It is small, easy to hide or lose, and can serve as a key or a bearer of a secret sign. Even if popular novels of the past did not specifically mention a ring, but rather, say, a missing brooch or talisman, in the collective memory, these details could merge into a single generalized image: the lost ring. In the 20th century, cinema took up the baton. Historical and adventure films, especially those of the Soviet period, loved to revisit the theme of royal treasures. Stories about brave Chekists saving national treasures from white guards and foreign spies, or, conversely, about noble aristocrats trying to smuggle out family heirlooms, were extremely popular. Such films often featured fictional artifacts that were the subject of a hunt. Although there is no film directly titled The Lost Ring of Catherine the Great, the image itself was in the air, fueled by dozens of similar plots. After watching several such films, viewers could easily conclude that stories about missing royal jewels were based on real events, and the fictional artifact from the film began to be perceived as having actually existed. Contemporary mass culture, with its love of conspiracy theories, historical sensations, and alternative history, only reinforces this effect. Documentary films of dubious quality, articles in the tabloid press, and internet forums continue to perpetuate the myth, because mystery always sells better than boring archival research. Thus, the lost ring is not a historical fact, but a successful cultural product created and sustained by the power of artistic imagination. The legend of Catherine's lost ring is not unique. It ranks alongside other famous stories of lost treasures that have stirred the minds of adventurers and historians for centuries. A comparative analysis of these myths reveals common patterns in their emergence and development, as well as an understanding of why such stories prove so enduring. By placing the lost ring in the context of legends, such as the search for the Amber Room or Ivan the Terrible's library, we see that it is not a historical anomaly, but a typical representative of its genre, the historical myth of lost treasure. All these stories usually have several key elements in common, which ensure their popularity and longevity. First, at the center of each such legend is a powerful and often mysterious historical figure. In our case, it is Catherine the Great. In others, Ivan the Terrible or the Prussian king Frederick William I. The presence of a great name gives the lost object a special status, transforming it from a mere valuable item into a historical relic, a symbol of an entire era. Secondly, we are always talking about a treasure whose value is not limited to its material equivalent. The Amber Room is not just tons of amber, it is an unsurpassed masterpiece of art. Ivan the Terrible's library is not just a collection of books, it is a repository of the secret knowledge of antiquity. Similarly, the lost ring in mythological consciousness is not just a piece of jewelry, but a bearer of a certain mystery, power, or legacy. It is this intangible, sacred value that makes it the subject of such passionate searches. Thirdly, the key element is the mystery of its disappearance. The treasure disappears under dramatic, chaotic circumstances, during war, fire, revolution, or a palace coup. The Amber Room disappears in the crucible of World War II, and traces of Ivan the Terrible's library are lost in the turmoil and fires of Moscow. This atmosphere of chaos and destruction serves as the perfect breeding ground for legends, as it explains the lack of accurate information and documents. If the treasure had simply been stolen from a museum in peacetime, it would have been a criminal story, not a myth. It is the scale of the historical cataclysm that gives the disappearance its epic scope. Finally, all these legends are characterized by the almost complete absence of direct and reliable primary sources describing the object of the search itself. We know about the Amber Room mainly from photographs and memories, but its exact fate after its removal is unknown. We know about Ivan the Terrible's library only from a few contradictory accounts from the 16th century. The same is true of Catherine's ring. There is not a single reliable document confirming its existence. This information vacuum is the main driving force behind the myth, allowing every researcher and enthusiast to construct their own versions and theories. Thus, the story of the lost ring fits perfectly into this pantheon of great historical mysteries, being more of a cultural phenomenon than a real historical problem. Let's imagine for a moment that Catherine the Great's lost ring is not a myth, but a real artifact that will one day be found. How would experts in the 21st century be able to confirm or refute its authenticity? Modern science and technology provide historians and art experts with a powerful arsenal of methods for attributing antique items with unprecedented accuracy. Studying these methods is not only interesting in itself, but also emphasizes once again why any search without initial documentary evidence is doomed to failure. Even the most advanced technologies are powerless if there is nothing to compare the object in question with. The first step in any investigation would be a comprehensive gemological analysis. Using spectrometry and X-ray fluorescence analysis, gemologists could determine the exact chemical composition of the stones and the metal of the setting. This would make it possible, for example, to establish the deposit from which the stone was brought. If the hypothetical diamond in the ring turned out to be identical in composition to diamonds from the Indian Golconda mines, which were actively mined in the 18th century, this would be the first, albeit indirect, confirmation. Metallurgical analysis of the setting could reveal impurities characteristic of gold or silver, used by court jewelers of that era. Next, art experts would get involved. They would study the style of the stone's cut. In the 18th century, rose cuts and old cushion cuts were popular. If the stone in the ring had a modern brilliant cut, developed in the early 20th century, this would be irrefutable proof of forgery or later alteration. The jeweler's mark on the setting would also have been carefully examined if it had survived. Using microscopes, experts would have compared it with known marks of masters from the Catherine era, such as Posier or Duval. Any discrepancy in the smallest details of the font or design would raise suspicion. Finally, the most important stage is archival work and establishing the provenance, i.e., the history of ownership of the item. This is where the main problem lies. To prove that the ring belonged to Catherine, it is necessary to find its description in palace inventories, correspondence, and jewelers' accounts. Without this documentary evidence, even the most ancient and beautiful ring remains just an 18th century ring, and not Catherine the Great's ring. In the world of antiques, there are known cases when sensational finds, supposedly belonging to the Romanovs, turned out to be either high-quality fakes or simply antique items with no proven history. Modern technologies can distinguish old from new and determine the composition of materials, but they cannot create history where there was none. This is precisely why the scientific community is not involved in the search for the lost ring, because there is no standard, no description, no starting point for this search. It's like looking for a black cat in a dark room, especially when it was never there in the first place. The pursuit of the mythical lost ring and other lost jewels, fascinating as it is, risks obscuring the true scale of Catherine the Great's legacy. By focusing on the glitter of diamonds, it is easy to overlook the most important thing that this empress left behind. Her true, imperishable treasure is not stones and metals, but her enormous contribution to Russian and world culture, to state building, and to the self-awareness of the nation. This legacy cannot be sold at auction or hidden away in a private collection. It belongs to everyone and continues to live on, shaping the image of Russia to this day. Shifting the focus from fictional relics to real achievements allows us to see the true, rather than legendary, greatness of her era. The main jewel in its crown is undoubtedly the State Hermitage Museum. It began as her personal collection, a secluded corner from the French Hermitage, where she kept the paintings she had bought in Europe. In 1764, Catherine acquired a large collection of paintings from the merchant Johann Gotskowski in Berlin, and this date is considered the founding year of the museum. During her reign, she added thousands of masterpieces to the collection, buying entire collections from the heirs of European aristocrats. Rembrandt, Rubens, Raphael, the best masters of European painting, adorned the walls of her palace. She did not simply buy paintings, she formed a world-class collection, laying the foundation for one of the greatest museums on the planet. Today, millions of people can see these treasures, and this is her direct and tangible gift to posterity, incomparably more valuable than any ring. Her legacy is also immortalized in stone. It was under her reign that St. Petersburg finally acquired its austere, harmonious, imperial appearance. She completed the ensemble of Palace Square by building the small Hermitage and the Hermitage Theater. She commissioned such masterpieces of classicism as the Marble Palace and the Academy of Arts. She invited the best architects of her time to Russia: Vallon Delamotte, Rinaldi, Cameron, and Quarenghi, who created the unique architectural landscape of the imperial capital. And, as we already know, it was she who initiated the creation of the Boulevard Ring in Moscow, transforming the old fortress walls into a green area for the city's residents to relax. These cities and buildings are also her legacy, her treasures, which must not be lost. Finally, there is her intellectual legacy. Catherine was not just a monarch, she was a philosopher on the throne. Her famous Instruction, written for the Commission on the Code, became one of the most progressive political documents of its time, in which she set forth the principles of enlightened absolutism based on the works of Montesquieu and Beccaria. Her long correspondence with Voltaire, Diderot, and other Enlightenment thinkers is a unique monument to 18th century thought. She founded the Russian Academy for the study of the Russian language and literature and encouraged book printing and journalism. It is this cultural and intellectual wealth, not mythical jewelry, that constitutes the true treasure of Catherine. This treasure cannot be stolen or forged, and it continues to bear dividends, enriching Russian culture. So, our long investigation, conducted in museum halls, archive files, and the recesses of folk legends, is coming to its logical conclusion. We have traced the path of Catherine the Great's treasures, from the glittering balls of the 18th century to the dramatic auctions of the 20th. We have weighed all the pros and cons, separated fact from fiction, and are now ready to give a definitive answer to the question that was posed at the very beginning of our journey. The mystery of Catherine the Great's lost ring has been solved, and the answer is that there was never any mystery. It is a beautiful, fascinating, but still a myth, a phantom born of a bizarre mixture of historical facts, collective memory, and artistic imagination. Let's gather all the threads of our investigation together once again. No reliable historical document, neither palace inventories, financial reports, catalogs of the Diamond Fund, nor the Empress's personal correspondence contains the slightest mention of the existence of a special, sacred ring that could have become the subject of a legend. The activities of court jewelers were strictly regulated and documented. Their task was to create real, not mythical, treasures. So where did this persistent myth come from? We have identified several possible sources. First, there is linguistic and historical confusion. Catherine's grandiose urban development project, Moscow's Boulevard Ring, could have been transformed in the popular imagination into an image of personal adornment. This could have been compounded by contamination with the religious story of the mystical wedding ring of St. Catherine, the heavenly patroness of the Empress. Secondly, the chaos of the Revolution and the subsequent sale of imperial valuables provided fertile ground for the myth. The tragedy of the loss of real, documented treasures gave rise in the collective consciousness to a powerful and dramatic symbol of all these losses, the image of a single, but most important, lost ring. Thirdly, this legend was actively fueled and continues to be fueled by literature, cinema, and contemporary mass culture, for which mystery and treasure hunts are an eternal source of inspiration and commercial success. Ultimately, the story of the lost ring tells us much more about ourselves than about Catherine's era. It speaks of our craving for miracles, our desire to believe that behind the dry facts of history lie unsolved mysteries and secret signs. It reflects our nostalgia for a bygone era of imperial grandeur, which seems to us more vivid and romantic than our own reality. But the true greatness of Catherine and her era lies not in fictional talismans, but in her real deeds, in the hermitage she founded, in the cities she built, in the territories she annexed, and in the tremendous cultural impetus she gave to Russia. And this legacy, unlike the mythical ring, cannot be lost or stolen. It will remain with us forever. The mystery has been solved. The ring was never lost because it never existed.